Hello and welcome to Skeletal System, Unit number 3, Topic number 5, Vertebral Column, Vertebrae, and Bony Thorax. The learning targets for this topic are Roman numeral 3, letter E, and specifically within that, the vertebral column and the thoracic cage. So let us get started. First off, when we're thinking of the vertebral column, just some general information. Remember that it is extending from the base of the skull all the way down into your pelvis. This portion of the skeleton is also giving support not only to the head at the top of this column, but also to the whole abdomen, the whole torso of your body. All muscles attaching to this vertebral column, and as we'll talk more in future lectures coming up. Also remember too, this is a major section of the axial skeleton. And in terms of just its general pieces, we'll say some details shortly here, but we have obviously many different types of vertebrae. We have between them the intervertebral discs between each of the vertebral bodies. Remember from histology, those are fibrocartilage. They're like small little shock absorbers between the bodies of each of the vertebrae. At the top is the cervical vertebrae. There are 7, literally just numbered 1 through 7 from the top down. We'll look at each in detail in a few minutes. And this is typically what you think of as your neck. This is followed by 12 thoracic vertebrae, simply numbered 1 through 12 after C7. And then come the lumbar vertebrae. You think of these as your lower back region. There are 5 of them. Then a single sacrum, which is really 5 vertebrae that during development fuse into a single one piece, seen here, posterior view, which exists between the two halves of the pelvis. And then the coccyx, which is also 3 or 4 individual vertebrae that fuse during development into a single piece. There's also a few curvatures we should be aware of. And to get ourselves oriented here, this is the posterior side, this is the anterior side, so ventral here, dorsal here. So in the cervical region, we see that there is a curvature. It curves in a ventral way. Then we have a curvature through the whole thoracic region, which goes in a posterior direction. Then the lumbar region has a curvature again in the anterior way. Then sacrum and coccyx together sort of make a single curving into the anterior direction. Okay, and with the posterior curvature on its posterior side here. This is a significant point which you'll learn about later when we discuss male and female pelvises. Okay, looking here at a typical vertebrae, this happens to be a thoracic vertebrae, but just for vertebrae in general, here are some parts that we want you to understand, to be able to recognize and be aware of for all vertebrae, no matter what region they originally come from. And it goes like this. This is the vertebral body right here. Sure, up here it talks about a rough zone and a smooth zone, but you know what? In our class we don't really differentiate. We just look at this entire piece here and we say this is the vertebral body. And again, to get oriented, this is anterior side, this is the posterior side. So the body of the vertebrae are located anteriorly. So here's my body. Then I have this large opening right here. This is the vertebral foramen. The spinal cord runs up and down through this foramen. Then I have connecting from the body to this lateral region here a pedicle, and then the same on this side, a little nice bony structure called a pedicle. Then there's a rather substantial transverse process on both sides, which has primarily this areas, and same thing with this posterior spinous process, areas for attachment of back muscles. Then there's a piece between the lateral transverse process and the posterior spinous process on both sides called the lamina. So we have lamina here and here. We have our posterior projecting spinous process. We have lateral projecting transverse processes. We have a pedicle that attaches that transverse process to the body on both sides, the body proper, and the vertebral foramen. And we also have typically these superior and inferior facets, articular facets, but you can't really see the inferior ones because they would be directly beneath these in the picture. The superior articular facets face posteriorly. The inferior ones, which you can't really see, their articular facet faces anteriorly. The point being that if you stack your vertebrae, these one from the one above locks in with the one below, and it helps keep your vertebrae in a straight line without becoming misaligned when you move your body. Let's take a look here in the cervical region first. Starting off with C1 and C2, cervical 1 and 2. They've got sort of a special condition for them. First of all, when you look at them, right off the bat, you go, okay, these look really weird and nothing like the picture that I just showed and said that was a typical vertebrae. So here's C1. It's the first cervical vertebrae, and it gets a special name. It's called the atlas because it literally holds up the head, sort of like ancient Greek atlas holds up the world. So the atlas, C1, holds up your head. This is the superior articular facets of the atlas, and what happens is the condyles of the occipital bone of your skull rest directly on top of this. And so that's why we say the atlas holds up your skull. This cervical vertebrae, C1, sits directly on top of C2. Here are the superior articular facets for C2. C1 drops right on top of that, and C2 has this projection called a dens. C2 itself is called the axis because this allows the head to rotate. Actually, the atlas holding the skull rotates left and right on the axis, and this dens portion comes up and presses right against this facet here on the atlas. So C1, the atlas, cervical vertebrae number 1, gets a special name atlas. C2, cervical vertebrae number 2, gets a special name also, the axis. Atlas holds the skull, sits on the axis. It can turn left and right on the axis. So axis for turning, atlas for holding your skull up. Oh, here, check out this next slide, which is a close-up of a typical cervical vertebrae. The significant features here are, well, first of all, number 1, this transverse foramen in the transverse processes. No other vertebrae have this, only cervicals, all of them, 7, all 7, 1 through 7, all have it. And the purpose here is to transmit the vertebral artery, which goes up both sides of your neck and into the base of your skull and into the circle of Willis for bringing blood supply to your brain, which we'll learn about in later lectures. But notice overall too how very thin and lightly constructed a cervical vertebrae looks. This is the body that you can see on C3 through 7. Very, very thin and light. The whole vertebrae looks very thin and light. These are the superior articular facets where each vertebrae attaches to, or I should say, comes in contact with the one above it. So light body. This is my vertebral foramen here, spinal cord passing through there. This is the posterior side. This is the spinous process. And typically on cervical vertebrae, they oftentimes are bifurcated like that. By comparison, let's look at a typical thoracic vertebrae. So here's a typical thoracic vertebrae. First thing right off the bat that you're going to notice about these is that the body is a little bit heavier. So the thoracic vertebrae has a slightly larger body. Think of its location, T1 through 12. Pretty much the whole main section of your thorax. It's going to be carrying much more weight than the cervical vertebrae were, and therefore much more substantial body, and overall structures too are heavier and a little bit more rugged looking. In addition, the vertebral foramen is still about the same as always, in the same position, kind of nice and round. But note, there are no longer any transverse foramen, and there won't be in any other vertebrae at all. But these are still the transverse processes. This is still the spinous process. And another feature about thoracic vertebrae, if you look here in the lateral view, note that the spinous processes have a very definitive downward projection, inferior projection. In this way, when you bend over or really flex your spinal vertebral column, those downward projecting spinous processes still maintain a bit of overlap with the one below it, and therefore keeping a constant bony covering over your spinal cord. Then we still have our superior articular facets here with the inferiors below. Here's a couple of interesting features that are only found on thoracic vertebrae. Right here, this facet, a little demi-facet on the body of the vertebrae, and then there's a facet out here too on the ends of the transverse processes. That's for the articulation of the ribs, because ribs only articulate with thoracic vertebrae. The head of the ribs attach here at the body. That's the little hyaline cartilage on both. This is a joint, just like we talked about in previous lectures. Then the rib will project in a inferolateral direction. It'll curve. It'll touch this bit of this lateral transverse process and then just curve around in a anterior way, ending up with eventually your sternum. And we'll look at that at the end of this particular lecture. So again, these are the pedicles on both sides, the lamina on both sides, the body. What else of significance? I think that's pretty good. Just note overall, if you will, the larger, more substantial, heavy-duty kind of nature of the overall structure when compared to a cervical vertebrae. Also, if you look here, take this vertebrae, imagine you turn it sideways and stick it underneath this one. Right here under the pedicle, I've got this fairly substantial notch. And right here on top of the pedicles, I've got a tiny bit of a groove. So if I put any two vertebrae, stack them together like they would be in your vertebral column, you have this very nice little opening here on the side, on both the left and the right side of the vertebrae, just posterior to the body of the vertebrae. That is the intervertebral foramen, not to be confused with the vertebral foramen here. Just behind the body, the central vertebral foramen transmits your spinal cord. The intervertebral foramen transmits spinal nerves at each spinal cord level. This is where your motor and sensory nerves are coming in and out of your spinal cord, exiting the bony protective covering of your vertebral column at each level through these cool little notch made here between each adjacent vertebrae. Here's a typical lumbar vertebrae. Look at the size of this thing. Really substantial body, huge, massive, heavy body, very thick, strong structural supports here. The transverse processes and the spinous processes are very short and very broad, stocky looking. Even the articular facets are pretty heavy looking. The vertebral foramen is kind of a little bit smaller here, and if you think about it, we're way down in the lumbar region now, and we've just got nerves left over that still need to exit the spinal cord that are just going to the lower extremity, but all the rest of your body from, say, your hips on up has already been served. All those nerves have left, so we're already down to a little bit smaller vertebral foramen and a really massive heavy body, because these guys, these bodies of these 5 lumbar vertebrae, they're bearing the main weight of your entire torso and upper extremities and everything from about the hips up. So a huge amount of weight bearing going on here, and remember that crazy angle that they had too in the lateral view of the vertebral column, and big heavy intervertebral discs on top. And remember, when you think of the intervertebral disc, that fibrocartilage, it's got a thick kind of tough outer ring, the annulus fibrosus, and a nucleus pulposus, a little bit softer inner circle. It's that nuclear circular part that tends to rupture when someone says, oh, I have a ruptured disc or something like that. Typically bulges in a posterior direction. And then the problem would be, if I'm looking right here and I've got that intervertebral foramen opening right here and coming like straight out of the picture at us, if I have a disc and it bulges into this region, I'm pressing on a spinal nerve, it's going to be insanely uncomfortable. And that's typically how that kind of scenario goes. But just big, heavy structures here for weight bearing. All the names are the same as they were for the thoracic and the cervical, but of course there's no transverse foramen here. And then the next step from there would be to go and look at the sacrum. Sacrum is 5 different vertebrae fused during development. In the sacrum, anterior view here, you've got the foramen off on the sides where the spinal nerves are still coming out. This is a posterior view. What else can we say? Well, coccyx here, same thing. 3 or 4 vertebrae fused again into a single entity. And really this is sort of like a little shock absorber when you go to sit down. Comparing vertebrae, because you realize now that we've entered this topic, you're going to be tossed a vertebrae here or there just at random, and you want to quickly be able to identify it as soon as it lands in your hand as to which kind it is, a cervical, a thoracic, or a lumbar. So here we have just in general a cervical vertebrae, a thoracic one, a lumbar, and here's the sacrum. Well, the sacrum and the coccyx, you can't even see it. These numbers have really obliterated the view of the coccyx, but that is such a strangely triangular shaped piece that you're not going to confuse that with anything else. So let's go on how we're going to tell these three vertebrae apart. Some of the quickest and simplest things. Well, first of all, these cervical ones are going to be incredibly thin and light looking compared to the others. And they're going to have that giant telltale transverse foramen. You see some holes over here, and you don't have to know what cervical level it is. The only ones you have to know that level of detail for will be C1 and C2. The atlas and the axis. And they really have a unique look to them. You see them a couple of times, you'll know them forever. So any other thing you get that's rather light looking and has holes in the transverse foramen, you know it's a cervical vertebrae and that kind of bifurcated spinous process if they've got it. The typical lumbar vertebrae, just hold it in your hand, look at it laterally, see if that spinous process isn't projecting inferiorly. That alone could tell you that it's a thoracic vertebrae. Also look at the transverse processes. They project laterally, but still a little bit posteriorly too. Whereas the lumbar vertebrae are massive, big, and heavy, big, chunky things. You can't really confuse them with anything else. And their transverse processes and spinous processes are practically like ping pong paddles. They're just big, flat, stubby things, which nothing else looks like that. And no one's got a body that heavy looking. Alright, so those are some typical easy ways to tell the three vertebrae apart. You'll be doing that soon enough. Okay, the last thing we want to look at tonight is the thoracic cage. A couple of items of significance about the thoracic cage that we want to pull out are these. Again, it's still part of the axial skeleton, including the sternum, this piece right here. The manubrium is the top part of the sternum. This jugular notch, if you put your finger right at the top of your very top of your sternum, right in that notch, right in the center of your throat there, you've got your finger in your jugular notch. If you move over slightly to either side, you're feeling right here at the edge of your manubrium where your first rib is attaching. If you run your finger down the front of your sternum from the jugular notch to that point where it feels like it goes over a little bump, and then you sort of realize you're on your sternum proper, that's the sternal angle right there, and then this would be considered the body of the sternum. So body of the sternum here, sternal angle here, all manubrium up here, jugular notch there. And this bit of cartilage here at the tip of your sternum is the xiphoid process. It's a little bit flexible, it is cartilage, and the rectus abdominis muscles that we'll learn about later come up and attach to here and on these costal regions and onto these ribs as well. So let's look at these ribs. There's three categories we want to think of. First one is true ribs. That would be ribs numbered 1 through 7. They're called true ribs. And the reason they're called true ribs is simply for this. Their cartilage, their costal cartilage, costal means rib, their costal cartilage comes from the tip of the bony end of the rib straight up to and attaches to the sternum, each one of those on either side. And therefore they're called true ribs. But ribs 8, 9, and 10 are called false ribs because each of them, their costal cartilage comes up and attaches to the cartilage of the rib above it, and then that goes to the sternum. So look, here's 8 going on to 7. Here's 9 going on to 8, going on to 7. Then 10 going on to 9, which goes on to 8, which goes on to 7, and then the sternum. So 8, 9, 10, false ribs, because their costal cartilages don't connect directly to the sternum proper. And then that leaves us just the last two, 11 and 12. And those are also false ribs, but they're even more complicated in their name because they're called false floating ribs. Because they, if you follow them out to their ends, they don't attach to anything. They literally end in the anterolateral aspects of your abdominal wall, just end in the muscle out there, and they stop. The rib cage purpose obviously is to give some kind of structural support to the muscles of this region, your respiratory muscles and all, but their main is a protective function here around all your vital organs, your heart and lungs, and even on the posterior aspect, your kidneys a little bit. And it's surprisingly how high up your kidneys really are, but they are. All right, so there you go, the sternum. The sternum here, the ribs here, the true ribs, the false floating ribs. Remember also to include the particular rib number when you're giving names on test ends or quizzes, just to make sure you have everything covered. And that pretty much covers it for tonight too. So that's everything. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.